The air in the sanctum was a testament to absence. It held no dust, no stray currents from the city beyond the filtered walls, and most importantly, no scent. It was a sterile, refrigerated silence that seeped into the bones, a coldness Elian had known his entire life. He stood on the central dais, a figure carved from obedience, the white silk of his ceremonial robes pooling around his feet like liquid moonlight. The fabric was heavy, its texture a constant, abrasive reminder of its purpose. It was not for comfort. It was for presentation. A technician, her face a mask of professional neutrality, made a final adjustment to the discreet silver collar around his neck. A faint, almost imperceptible hum vibrated against his skin, the soft song of suppression. It was the machine that kept him pure, that kept him blank, a perfect, unwritten page for the alpha who would claim him. He was an asset. He was not a son. His father's hand, resting on his shoulder moments before, had felt like a brand of ownership, the pressure precise and proprietary. There was no warmth in the touch, only the weight of expectation. Elian kept his eyes fixed on the polished obsidian floor, watching his own distorted reflection. A pale, slender Omega, with eyes the color of a winter sky, too wide, too vacant. The reflection was a stranger he was forced to inhabit. He was a vessel for a bloodline, a crucial component in the grand architecture of their society. The city, a marvel of chrome and glass, was built on order, on the predictable, elegant mathematics of genetics. Alphas of premier lineage were matched with omegas of pristine genetic makeup. It was not about love. It was about legacy. Lord Valerius, the alpha to whom his family had promised him, was the pinnacle of that legacy. His was a name spoken in hushed, reverent tones in the high circles of governance. He was a man forged from control, his influence extending like a crystalline web across the city's every function. Elian had never met him, only seen his effigy in public broadcasts, a face with the severe beauty of a marble statue, eyes that held the cold, distant light of a dying star. His scent, they said, was like ozone and cold steel, the very essence of power and sterile authority. Elian's own scent, the one he barely remembered, was a flaw, a genetic ghost his family had spent a fortune to erase. They called it atavistic, a throwback to a wilder, less civilized time. It was a scent of rain-soaked earth and a flower they had no name for, a thing of chaos and nature that had no place in their world of curated perfection. The suppressants had muted it since his presentation at 16, leaving behind only a faint, clean neutrality, like freshly laundered linen. He was acceptable now. He was valuable. The low, resonant chime echoed through the sanctum, signaling the arrival. Elian's breath hitched, a tiny, insignificant betrayal of the calm he was meant to project. He could feel the shift in the Kai room's atmosphere, the subtle compression of the air as a dominant presence entered. He did not look up. He was not permitted to. The protocol was clear. He was to remain still, his gaze lowered, until the claim was made. The footsteps were silent on the obsidian, a testament to the owner's discipline. A shadow fell over him, long and sharp. He could feel the proximity of power, a static charge that made the fine hairs on his arms stand on end. The air grew colder, thinner. The faint metallic tang of ozone reached him even through the room's aggressive filtration systems. Lord Valerius. The silence stretched, a taut wire of scrutiny. Elian focused on the hum of the collar, on the weight of the silk, on the cold of the floor beneath his feet. He broke his body down into a series of disconnected sensations, a strategy to keep his mind from splintering. He was an object being appraised, a rare piece of art, a valuable commodity. The silence was a tool, he knew, a way to unnerve, to establish dominance before a single word was spoken. Finally, a voice, smooth and cold as polished stone, cut through the quiet. Acceptable. The word was not a compliment. It was a clinical assessment. It was directed at his father, who stood just beyond the dais, his posture rigid with a mixture of pride and anxiety. The genetic markers are pure. The presentation is flawless. Elian felt a phantom touch, a coldness that ghosted over his skin as Valerius circled the dais. He felt like a specimen under a microscope, every line of his body, every suppressed breath, catalogued and judged. He was not a person. He was a collection of desirable traits. He will serve the lineage well. His father's voice was tight, strained with deference. He has been conditioned for absolute compliance. A dry, mirthless sound, barely a chuckle, came from Valerius. Compliance is a given. It is his nature, merely refined by your conditioning. The alpha came to a stop directly in front of him. Elian could feel the sheer immensity of his presence, a gravitational pull that threatened to shatter his composure. Slowly, against every instinct screaming at him to flee, he lifted his gaze. Lord Valerius was exactly as his effigy had promised, impossibly perfect, inhumanly controlled. His eyes, the colour of silver frost, held no warmth, only a piercing, analytical intelligence. He looked at Elian not as a future mate, but as a complex equation he had already solved. Valerius raised a hand, his long, elegant fingers reaching for the clasp of the suppression collar. This was the moment, the claiming. The alpha would remove the collar, release the Omega's scent, and cover it with his own, a mark of permanent ownership visible to every alpha in the city. Elian's heart hammered a frantic, desperate rhythm against his ribs. This was the end of him, the final erasure of the boy who remembered the phantom scent of rain. He would become a vessel, a beautiful, empty house for the Valerius line. His fingers closed into fists within the long sleeves of his robes, his nails digging into his palms. A small, secret pain in a world of numb obedience. The cold metal of Valerius's fingertips brushed against the skin of his neck. The contact was electric, a jolt of ice and power that made him flinch. A flicker of annoyance crossed the alpha's perfect features. The Omega was not supposed to flinch. Just as his fingers began to work the clasp, a sound shattered the sacred silence of the sanctum. It was the discordant, brutal sound of the reinforced outer doors groaning, then crashing inward. Shouts erupted from the guards stationed outside, sharp cries of alarm, cut short by heavy, sickening thuds. The sterile peace of the room was violated, ripped apart by a sudden, violent intrusion. Every head in the room, including Valerius's, snapped towards the entrance. Elian's father gasped, his face paling in horror. Two figures stood silhouetted against the harsh, unfiltered light of the city corridor. Guards, their ceremonial armor dented, lay motionless at their feet. The lead figure stepped forward, moving with a fluid, predatory grace that was utterly alien to the rigid formality of the sanctum. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed not in the severe lines of city fashion, but in dark, functional fabrics that seemed to absorb the light. His hair was black and unruly, and his eyes, when they found Elian's, were the color of molten gold. They burned with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. But it was his scent that struck Elian first, a shockwave that bypassed the room's filters and his own collar's suppression. It was wild and untamed, a scent of ancient forests, of snow-laden pine and cold, clean earth. It was a scent of freedom. It was a scent of life. It crashed against the sterile ozone of Valerius's presence, not yielding, but consuming it. The stranger's gaze locked onto Elian, a look of fierce, undeniable possession that had nothing to do with lineage or contracts. It was primal. It was absolute. Lord Valerius slowly lowered his hand from Elian's neck, his body turning to face the intruder with a deliberate, chilling calm. The air crackled, thick with the clash of two immense, opposing forces. "You have made a grave error," Valerius stated, his voice dropping to a register that was pure menace. "There is no place in this city for you to hide." The stranger ignored him. His golden eyes never left Elian. He took another step into the sanctum, his presence dominating the space, making it feel small and fragile. He looked at the collar on Elian's neck, and a low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound so feral it raised the hair on Elian's skin. Then he spoke, his voice a low, resonant timbre that vibrated through the obsidian floor. He did not address Valerius. He did not address Elian's father. He made a declaration to the entire room, to the universe itself. "You cannot claim what is already mine." The stranger's words hung in the air, a blade severing the timeline of Elian's life into two distinct parts, the suffocating obedience that came before and the terrifying, unknown chaos that had just begun. The silence that followed was heavier, more profound than the one that had preceded it. It was a silence born of shock, of a reality so thoroughly fractured that no one knew how to react. Elian's father made a choked, strangled sound, a noise of pure disbelief and horror. Lord Valerius, however, remained unnervingly still. A single, perfect eyebrow, arched in something that might have been curiosity, or perhaps amusement. He was a being of absolute order, and this was an anomaly, a variable he had not accounted for. For Elian, the world had tilted on its axis. The stranger's scent, that impossible fragrance of pine and winter, was wrapping around him, a protective cloak against the sterile cold of Valerius's ozone. It felt familiar. It was a deeply buried memory, a song his blood knew, but his mind could not place. His heart, which had been hammering with fear, now beat with a different, more powerful rhythm. It was a wild, frantic drumbeat of recognition. The stranger's golden eyes held his, and in their depths, Elian saw not the cold assessment of an owner, but the fierce, unwavering certainty of a promise. Who was he? The man took another step forward, and the remaining guards, finally shaking off their stupor, moved to intercept him, their energy batons humming to life. They were a formality, a part of the city's pageantry of security, and they were hopelessly outmatched. The stranger moved like a phantom, a blur of dark cloth and coiled strength. He did not kill them. He disabled them with a brutal, economic efficiency that was breathtaking to watch. A precise strike to a wrist, a disabling blow to a knee. They crumpled, their armor clattering on the obsidian floor, their batons skittering away. It was over in seconds. He came to a stop just at the edge of the dais, his gaze still locked on Elian. He was close enough now that Elian could see the fine details of his face, a faint scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the intensity that tightened the lines around his mouth. He was not handsome in the curated, symmetrical way of city alphas. He was beautiful in the way a storm is beautiful, powerful, untamable, and real. An impressive display of primitive aggression, Valerius said, his voice laced with a cold, detached irony. He had not moved. He watched the scene as a scientist might observe a particularly fascinating chemical reaction. But your claim is baseless. There are no records of this Omega being bonded. His lineage is meticulously documented. His existence, from conception, has been a matter of public record for those of my station. The stranger finally turned his head, his golden eyes meeting Valerius's silver ones. The clash was palpable, a silent war waged in the space between them. Your records are incomplete, the stranger said, his voice low and steady. Your city is built on lies. You tell yourselves about purity and order. You document what you can measure. You cannot measure a bond forged in fire and ice long before your machines learned how to numb the soul. He looked back at Elian, his expression softening, almost imperceptibly. He wears your collar, but his scent calls to me. It always has. Elian's breath caught in his throat. His scent. But he had no scent. It had been chemically scoured from his being, replaced with a sterile nothingness. Yet this stranger spoke as if he could perceive the ghost of it, the true self buried beneath layers of conditioning and technology. It was impossible. It was also the truest thing anyone had ever said to him. Valerius's lips curved into a semblance of a smile. It did not reach his eyes. Scent memory is a powerful yet unreliable phenomenon, a delusion. You are an unregistered alpha, a feral element from the wastes. You see a high-value asset and invent a narrative of connection to justify your trespass. It is a predictable, if crude, strategy. He gestured dismissively. You will be taken into custody. Your unique biology might be of some interest to my research divisions. As for the Omega, he turned his silver gaze back to Elian, and the coldness in them intensified. He will need to be recalibrated. This disruption has likely caused a degree of emotional instability. It will be corrected. The word corrected sent a sliver of ice through Elian's veins. He knew what it meant. Deeper conditioning, memory wipes, a complete and utter stripping away of this moment, of this stranger, until nothing remained but the placid, compliant shell they desired. The stranger's jaw tightened. A low growl, more pronounced this time, vibrated in his chest. His name is Elian, he said, the words sharp and clear. He is not an asset. He is not an experiment. And you will not touch him. He said his name. In this room where he was only the Omega, a title, a function, the stranger had given him back his name. The sound of it from his lips was a reclamation. Elian felt a tremor run through him, a crack forming in the porcelain facade of his composure. A single hot tear escaped and traced a path down his cold cheek. Valerius's smile widened slightly. He had found a weakness. Ah, he responds to you. How fascinating. The imprinting is stronger than I would have predicted from a feral. He tapped a command into a thin, almost invisible datapad on his wrist. Security enforcers are en route. They are authorized for lethal force. Surrender, and the Omega will be treated with relative gentleness. The threat was clear, delivered with the casual cruelty of a god swatting a fly. But the stranger didn't flinch. His focus remained absolute. They can try, he said softly. Then he did something that defied all logic, all protocol. He stepped onto the dais. He entered the sacred space of the claiming. He reached out, his hand moving slowly, giving Elian time to react, to pull away. But Elian was frozen, caught between a lifetime of trained obedience and a powerful, instinctual pull toward this impossible man. The stranger's fingers, warm and calloused, brushed against his cheek, right where the tear had fallen. The touch was gentle, reverent. It was the first truly gentle touch Elian could remember feeling in his entire life. It was not proprietary, it was not clinical. It was a question. It was an offering. And then the stranger did something even more profound. He leaned in, his head bent, and he inhaled, his nose close to the skin of Elian's neck, right beside the humming collar. He closed his eyes, a look of sublime recognition on his face. "There it is," he whispered, so softly only Elian could hear. "Wild hyacinth and winter air. I would know you in 1,000 lifetimes, Elian." Wild hyacinth, the flower with no name, the ghost scent from his fragmented dreams. He knew. He knew the truth of him. In that moment, the entire carefully constructed world of Elian's life shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. The sanctum, Lord Valerius, his father's ambition, it all faded into the background, becoming a distant, meaningless tableau. There was only the warmth of this stranger's hand on his face, the impossible truth of his words, and the wild, terrifying hope blooming in his chest. He was not an empty vessel. He was Elian, and someone, across an impossible distance of time and social strata, had come for him. The sound of heavy, armored footsteps echoed from the corridor, growing closer. The enforcers were coming. The moment was ending. But for the first time, Elian felt a surge of defiance. He met the stranger's golden eyes, and for the first time in his life, he was not afraid. He was found. Kale tracked the scent through the city's sterile arteries, a ghost moving through a world of ghosts. To him, the gleaming metropolis was a sensory wasteland, a symphony of artificiality that grated on his heightened perceptions. The air tasted of recycled oxygen, ozone from the maglev trains, and the cloying synthetic fragrances people wore to mask their own humanity. It was a dead place, a tomb of polished chrome and glass. But beneath it all, faint and almost entirely obscured, was the scent that had driven him from the snow-dusted pines of the wastes. It was a thread of life in a sterile shroud, a melody only he could hear. Wild hyacinth and winter air. Elian. He had followed it for 3 days, sleeping in maintenance tunnels and moving through the city's forgotten underbelly. His senses, his only guide. The scent grew stronger, more defined, as he drew closer to the city's core, the seat of its power and its corruption. It led him here, to this cold, white edifice that radiated an aura of absolute control. The sanctum. He knew of it from whispered stories, a place where omegas of high lineage were bartered and bonded like prized livestock. The thought sent a spike of cold fury through him. He remembered Elian not as a pristine asset in silk robes, but as a small, fierce boy with eyes the color of a winter sky and a laugh that could startle sleeping birds. They were children of the fringe, born in a settlement that had been pacified and assimilated when they were young. Their families were deemed genetically impure, their traditions and bonds dismissed as primitive. They had been separated, processed, and assigned new roles in the city's grand design. Kale, an alpha with a dangerously potent, atavistic scent, had been marked for a labor colony. He had escaped before they could send him there, melting into the vast, untamed wastes that the city feared and disdained. Elian, an omega whose unique scent was classified as a genetic anomaly, had been taken by a wealthy family, a project to be corrected and refined into a perfect, neutered prize. Kael had spent 10 years hardening himself in the wastes, surviving, learning, but never, not for a single day, forgetting the promise they had made to each other in the ruins of their home. A scent bond made in the innocent, desperate way of children who knew they were about to be torn apart. They had pressed their wrists together, mingling their blood and their scents, and sworn they would find each other again. A child's promise, perhaps, but for Kael it had become the central tenet of his existence. As he approached the sanctum, Elian's scent grew sharp with a new, terrifying note. Fear. It was a cold, high-pitched scent, like the edge of a razor, and underneath it, another scent, one that made the feral instincts in him rise with violent intent. It was an alpha scent, but it was wrong. It was cold, metallic, and utterly devoid of life. It smelled of machinery and arrogant power. It smelled like a cage. He knew he was running out of time. He did not bother with stealth as he entered the sanctum. There was no time for subtlety. The guards were obstacles, not threats. He moved through them with the efficiency of a predator, his actions guided by a single, unwavering purpose, to reach the source of that terrified scent. And then he saw him, standing on a raised platform, a pale, beautiful sacrifice, with the life leached out of him. The sight of the suppression collar around Elian's neck was a physical blow. They had muted him. They had tried to erase the very essence of him, the wild, beautiful scent that was as much a part of him as his own soul. And the other alpha, Lord Valerius, stood beside him, his hand reaching for that collar, his sterile presence a desecration of the sacred space around Elian. A rage, cold and absolute, settled in Kael's bones. It wasn't the hot, reckless fury of his youth, but the focused, lethal anger of a survivor. He would burn this entire city to the ground before he let that man lay a claiming hand on Elian. He strode into the room, the sound of the crashing doors a declaration of war. He met Elian's vacant, winter sky eyes, and for a heart-stopping moment he feared he was too late, that the boy he knew was already gone, buried beneath years of conditioning. But then he saw it, a flicker, a tiny spark of recognition in their depths. The soul was still there. It was just trapped. His words, "You cannot claim what is already mine," were not a boast. They were a statement of fact, a truth that superseded any law or contract this sterile city could devise. He watched, unimpressed, as Valerius analyzed him, categorized him as a feral. Let him. The man's arrogance was a weakness. He saw the world as a set of predictable variables, and Kael was a variable he could never comprehend. He was from the world outside their walls, a world that ran on instinct, on bonds, on promises kept in blood. He focused on Elian, on breaking through the layers of control. When he said his name, he poured all the years of searching, all the certainty of his belief in their bond, into the sound. He saw the tear trace a path down Elian's cheek and knew he had reached him. He had to. The enforcers were coming. He could hear the rhythmic stamp of their armored boots. He stepped onto the dais, crossing a line that, in this society, was punishable by immediate termination. He didn't care. He touched Elian's face, the skin soft and cold, and felt a jolt of connection, a current of energy that flowed between them, ancient and undeniable. And when he inhaled, deliberately breaking through the chemical neutrality of the collar, he found it. Faint, suppressed, but unmistakably there. Wild hyacinth and winter air. It was the scent of home. It was the scent of his purpose. The armored enforcers stormed into the sanctum, their pulse rifles raised. They formed a semicircle, cutting off all escape. Their polished visors reflected the scene, a dozen fractured images of the feral Alpha and the prized Omega. "Stand down," the lead enforcer commanded, his voice amplified and metallic. "Surrender your person for processing." Kale did not take his hand from Ilian's cheek. He kept his body positioned slightly in front of the Omega, a living shield. He met the lead enforcer's faceless visor. "I don't think so," he said, his voice dangerously soft. Lord Valerius watched from the side, his expression one of keen, scientific interest. He made no move to intervene, content to observe how his security systems dealt with this unexpected anomaly. "Lethal force is authorized," the enforcer warned. Kyle felt Elian tremble behind him, a small, involuntary movement. He sent a wave of calm through their nascent, reawakening bond, a feeling of steadfastness, of unwavering resolve. "I am here. I will not let them harm you." He didn't know if Elian could consciously receive it, but he felt the trembling lessen. "You hear that, Ilian?" Kale said, his voice still low, meant only for him. "They think they can scare us." He finally looked away from the enforcers, his golden eyes finding Elian's again. "Do you trust me?" It was the most important question he had ever asked. Ilian's life had been a monument to distrust, every action monitored, every thought conditioned, every relationship a transaction. Trust was a foreign concept, but looking into Kale's eyes, he felt the truth of him. He saw the boy from his ghost memories, the fierce protector, the other half of his soul. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. A slow, predatory smile touched Kale's lips. "Good." With a speed that seemed to defy physics, he moved. He spun, grabbing the heavy, ornate ceremonial brazier from the edge of the dais. It was filled with a slow-burning, scentless incense. With a roar, he hurled it not at the enforcers, but at the massive, paned window that made up one entire wall of the sanctum. The reinforced plasteel shrieked, spiderwebbing under the impact, but not breaking. That was not the point. The point was the distraction. As the enforcer's attention snapped to the window, Kyle grabbed Elian, pulling him close. "Hold on," he breathed into his ear. He didn't run for the door. That was what they expected. Instead, he ran directly toward Lord Valerius. The move was so audacious, so counterintuitive, that for a split second, everyone froze. Valerius himself showed the first hint of surprise, his eyes widening slightly. Kyle didn't attack him. He used him. Planting a foot on the ornate chair beside the Alpha, he launched himself and Elian upward toward the high, vaulted ceiling of the sanctum. A maintenance catwalk, almost invisible in the shadows, ran the length of the room. He landed on it with a soft thud, pulling a stunned Elian up with him. "Open fire!" the enforcer commander yelled, his voice tight with fury at being outmaneuvered. The air filled with the sharp, sizzling sound of pulse rifle discharges. Beams of crimson energy seared the space where they had been moments before, scorching the obsidian floor. Kyle pulled Elian along the narrow catwalk, moving with a sure-footed grace that spoke of a life lived on treacherous mountain ledges and in high forest canopies. Below them, the sanctum was a scene of chaos. Valerius had calmly stepped back, observing the tactical failure of his troops with cold disappointment. Elian's father was cowering behind a pillar. "This way," Kyle urged, his voice a low command in Elian's ear. He led him toward a ventilation shaft cover, its bolts already loosened. He'd scouted this route on his way in, his mind always mapping escape routes, a habit born of a lifetime on the run. He kicked the cover open and helped Elian into the darkness beyond. Just before he followed, he paused, looking down one last time. His golden eyes met Valerius's silver ones across the chaotic room. Kyle gave him a slow, deliberate smile, a promise of future conflict. Then he was gone, plunging into the metal guts of the city with the boy he had sworn to find held safe in his arms. The darkness of the ventilation shaft was absolute. The immediate aftermath in the sanctum was a study in controlled chaos. Lord Valerius did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His silence was more damning than any tirade. He stood amidst the scorched floor and the groaning, disabled guards, his silver eyes sweeping over the scene with the detached air of a general surveying a lost battle. The Enforcer commander approached him, his helmet tucked under his arm, his face pale and sweating despite the room's chill. "My lord," he began, his voice strained. "They vanished into the primary ventilation network. It's a labyrinth. We have units attempting to seal the major arteries, but he is a feral," Valerius finished for him, his voice soft as falling snow. "He is accustomed to labyrinths. You are accustomed to clear lines of fire on open ground. You failed to adapt." The commander flinched as if struck. "My lord, his tactics were unorthodox." "They were effective," Valerius corrected coolly, "which makes them, by definition, orthodox. It is your definition that is flawed." He dismissed the commander with a flick of his fingers and turned to Elian's father, who was now trembling, his face a mask of ruin. The man's greatest asset, his key to cementing his family's place in the upper echelons, had just been stolen from under his nose. "This is a catastrophe," the father whispered, his voice hoarse. "My family, our name." Valerius regarded him with an expression of profound disinterest. "Your name is of no consequence to me now. Your product was defective." "Defective? He was perfect, genetically pure, conditioned. He was imprinted," Valerius interrupted, the words sharp as broken glass. "By an unknown alpha, at an unknown time. A variable you failed to disclose, an imperfection of the highest order. Your contract is nullified. You will be billed for the damages to this facility and the loss of my time." The father looked as though he might collapse. The social and financial ruin would be absolute. Valerius turned away from him, his attention already elsewhere. He walked to the center of the dais, to the spot where Elian had stood. He knelt, his movements fluid and precise, and ran a gloved finger over the floor. He brought it close to his face, his sensitive alpha senses analyzing the faint traces of scent left behind, the sterile non-scent of the Omega, the ozone of his own presence, and underneath a third alien scent, pine and snow, and something else, something that had bloomed in the final moments, the ghost of the Omega's true scent, coaxed out by the feral's proximity, wild hyacinth and winter air. It was a combination his databases did not recognize. It was not merely atavistic, it was entirely novel, a new data point. His cold, analytical mind began to race. This was no longer a simple matter of a broken contract. It was a scientific curiosity of the highest order. A feral alpha whose primal bonding instincts could override years of chemical and psychological conditioning. An omega with a unique, uncatalogued scent profile that responded to that specific alpha. A bond that existed outside the carefully regulated system he oversaw. It was a threat, of course, a dangerous anomaly that could, if understood and replicated, destabilize the very foundations of their society. But every threat was also an opportunity. He was not a man driven by simple possession or wounded pride. He was driven by the pursuit of knowledge and the perfection of control. He had wanted Elian as a vessel for his lineage, a beautiful, pristine, and ultimately predictable component. But this was infinitely more interesting. The feral had called Elian by his name. He had spoken of a bond forged in fire and ice. This suggested a shared history, a past that existed before the city's meticulous records began. He tapped his datapad, his fingers flying across the holographic surface. Access archival records, fringe settlement assimilation program, 10 to 12 years prior. Cross-reference genetic markers for the Omega Elian of House Arden, with all processed subjects from that period. Search for a corresponding alpha candidate with a high-potency atavistic scent profile. The system whirred, sifting through mountains of forgotten data. Valerius watched, his expression unreadable. He was no longer hunting a thief who had stolen his property. He was a researcher who had just discovered a new species. He wanted to understand the mechanism of their bond. He wanted to isolate the variables. He wanted to dissect their connection, learn its secrets, and then he wanted to control it. The escape was a temporary setback. The city was his laboratory, a closed system. They could run, but they could not truly hide. "My lord," an aide approached timidly. "What are your orders?" Valerius looked up from his datapad, a faint, chilling smile gracing his lips for the first time. "Do not seal the ventilation shafts. Let them run. Track them. I want telemetry on their movements, their biometrics if possible. I want to observe their behavior in a stressed environment." The aide looked confused. "Observe, my lord, not capture." "Capture is the end of the experiment," Valerius said softly. "And this one has just begun." He turned his silver gaze toward the gaping, dark maw of the ventilation shaft. Out there, in the metallic veins of his city, his new subjects were moving. He would give them the illusion of freedom. He would let them believe they had escaped. He would watch them, study them, and when he had learned everything he could from them, he would retrieve them. And this time, he would not be interested in mere compliance. He would be interested in deconstruction. The feral was wrong. Elian was not a person. He was a puzzle, and Valerius was a master of solving them. He did not lose. He simply refined his methods. The chase was on. The darkness inside the ventilation system was absolute and disorienting. It was a world of close metal walls, the smell of dust and ozone, and the echoing sound of their own frantic movements. Kyle, now Kale. Elian's mind latched onto the name as a drowning man clutches a piece of driftwood, pulled him through the tight spaces with a confidence that bordered on supernatural. His hand was a warm, firm anchor in the terrifying dark. Elian stumbled, his ceremonial robes catching on unseen rivets, the soft silk a ridiculous encumbrance in this gritty industrial underworld. His lungs burned, his body, accustomed to a life of placid stillness, screaming in protest. Every conditioned instinct told him this was wrong. He should be back in the sanctum, docile and still. He should be with Lord Valerius. The thought of the cold alpha sent a spasm of revulsion through him, so potent it almost made him gag. That feeling, that powerful rejection, was more real than anything he had felt in years. It was his own. Kale paused in a junction where several shafts converged, his head tilted as if listening to something Elian couldn't hear. The only sound was the distant, omnipresent hum of the city's life support systems. "They're not sealing the shafts behind us," Kale murmured, his voice a low rumble in the enclosed space. "They're letting us run." "Why?" Elian whispered, his voice raspy. "He's watching us," Kale replied, his tone grim. "We're a curiosity to him now, an experiment." The thought was terrifying. They hadn't escaped. They were merely rats in a new, more complex maze. The illusion of freedom was, perhaps, worse than the gilded cage he had left behind. He felt a wave of despair wash over him. What had they accomplished? They had traded a pristine prison for a filthy one, all under the watchful eye of the same jailer. He sagged against the metal wall, his legs trembling. "We can't get away," he breathed, the words tasting of defeat. "The whole city is his." Kale turned in the darkness. Elian couldn't see his face, but he felt the intensity of his golden gaze. A hand cupped his jaw, fingers gentle but firm, tilting his head up. "Yes, it is," Kyle said softly, "which is why we're not staying in it." He began moving again, pulling Elian down a smaller, colder shaft. "There's a place, a flaw in the city's design, the old aqueduct system. It was abandoned when they implemented full water reclamation, but the primary conduits still run all the way to the outer wall. They pass through the Undercroft, where the city's surveillance is weakest." The Undercroft. Elian had only heard the name in whispers, the lowest level of the city, a place of shadows and forgotten things, where the dregs of society lived in the perpetual twilight beneath the gleaming towers. It was a place of chaos, of unregistered citizens and black markets. A place his conditioning screamed was full of contamination and danger. It sounded like freedom. They traveled for what felt like hours, the warm silence between them broken only by the scrape of their bodies against metal and their own ragged breathing. The initial adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a deep, aching exhaustion. But something else was happening to Elian. In the enclosed space, away from the sanctum's filters and the city's artificial air, the scents were becoming more real. The metallic tang of the ductwork, the dust, and Kale. His scent was an overwhelming presence in the dark. Pine, snow, and something else. The warm, living scent of his skin, the salt of his sweat. It wasn't just a scent. It was a narrative. It spoke of wild, open spaces, of resilience, of a life lived on its own terms. And as Elian breathed it in, something inside him began to stir. The ghost of his own scent, the wild hyacinth and winter air, felt less like a ghost. It was a faint, dormant thing, a seed buried under frozen ground, but for the first time he could feel the potential of its life. It was responding to Kale's presence, a chemical recognition that ran deeper than memory. Fragmented images flickered at the edges of his consciousness. Two small children huddled together for warmth in the shell of a ruined building, the shared taste of a stolen piece of bread. A small, dark-haired boy with fierce, golden eyes pressing a crushed wildflower into his hand. "Its scent is like yours," the boy had said. "It grows where nothing else can." Kyle. It was him. The memories were not yet whole, but the feeling they evoked was undeniable. A sense of safety, of belonging, that he had never known in his sterile, perfect life with the family that had bought him. Finally, Kale stopped before a large, rusted grate. He worked at it for a moment, his muscles straining, and it came away with a low groan. A new scent wafted up from the opening below. Damp earth, decay, and 1,000 commingled human smells, the scent of the undercroft. "It's a long drop," Kyle said. "I'll go first. You'll have to jump. I'll catch you." Elian peered into the inky blackness below. He couldn't see the bottom. His conditioning, his entire life, had been about avoiding risk, about preserving his pristine body. To jump into a black abyss was an act of madness. He hesitated. Kyle dropped through the hole, his descent ending with a soft thud that echoed in the space below. "It's all right, Elian," his voice floated up, calm and reassuring. "I've got you. I will always catch you. I will always catch you." The words resonated with a deep, forgotten promise. He remembered falling from a tree, the brief, terrifying moment of weightlessness, and then the jarring but safe landing in Kyle's arms. He had been laughing. They had both been laughing. He took a breath. He closed his eyes. And for the first time in his life, Elian chose to trust. He jumped. The fall was brief, a stomach-lurching plunge into the unknown. He braced for impact, but instead of a hard landing, he was enveloped by strong arms. Kale held him, absorbing the force of his fall, holding him steady as his legs trembled. For a moment, they just stood there in the darkness. Elian pressed against Kale's chest, his face buried in the crook of his neck. He could feel the steady, powerful beat of Kyle's heart against his cheek. He was real. This was real. He inhaled deeply, and for the first time, he didn't just smell Kale's scent. He felt it, a profound and calming reassurance that settled deep in his bones. It was the scent of his own safety. Reluctantly, he pulled back. Kyle didn't let him go entirely, his hands resting on Elian's waist. A small, ambient light from a distant lumen strip filtered into the space, illuminating their surroundings. They were in a massive cylindrical tunnel, its walls slick with moisture. The old aqueduct. "Now comes the hard part," Kyle said, his voice low. "We walk, and we try not to be seen." He finally released Elian, but the warmth of his presence lingered. He tore a long strip from Elian's ruined silk robe. "Here," he said, gently tying back Elian's pale hair. "Best not to stand out." He then shrugged off his own dark outer jacket and draped it over Elian's shoulders. It was heavy and smelled overwhelmingly of him. It felt like armor. As they began to walk through the echoing tunnel, side by side, Elian felt the last vestiges of the Omega from the sanctum falling away. He was not an asset. He was not a prize. He was a survivor. And for the first time, he was not alone. The journey ahead was uncertain, and the shadow of Lord Valerius loomed over them. But here, in the dark, walking beside the boy from his past, Elian felt a flicker of something he had never dared to feel before. Hope. It was a fragile, tentative thing, but like the flower whose scent he carried, it was determined to grow where nothing else could. The Undercroft was a city beneath the city, a sprawling, chaotic ecosystem thriving in the perpetual gloom. The air was thick and humid, a tapestry of smells both organic and industrial. Steam from cracked pipes, the spicy aroma of street food cooked over makeshift heat coils, the metallic tang of unregulated workshops, and the overwhelming, earthy scent of thousands of human lives pressed together. For Elian, whose entire existence had been a curated sensory deprivation, it was an assault. His head swam with the sheer volume of information, the unfiltered reality of it all. But Kyle moved through the crowded, narrow streets with the ease of a native, his hand never far from Elian's arm, a silent, grounding presence in the overwhelming chaos. The jacket he wore, saturated with Kyle's scent, became a shield, a small pocket of familiar territory in this alien landscape. They kept to the shadows, moving along the edges of the bustling thoroughfares. The people of the Undercroft paid them little mind. Everyone here had a story they preferred to keep hidden. A stranger in dark clothes and a pale, wide-eyed companion were just two more secrets in a city of them. They found a small, hidden alcove behind a steam vent to rest. The hot, damp air billowed around them, offering a temporary cloak of invisibility. Elian sank to the ground, his body trembling with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. Kale handed him a small, nutrient-dense ration bar he produced from a pocket. It tasted chalky and strange, nothing like the carefully formulated sustenance he was used to. But it was real. It was fuel. "We need to get you different clothes," Kale said, his eyes scanning Elian's ruined white robes. "They mark you as someone from up top, someone with value." The word value made Elian flinch. He had been valued his whole life, and it had been a curse. He wanted to be worthless. He wanted to be invisible. And the collar. Kyle's voice hardened, his golden eyes fixing on the silver band around Elian's neck. "We have to get that off you. It's a tracker." Elian's hand flew to his neck. Of course it was. Lord Valerius was not a man to leave things to chance. He was not just watching them. He was tracking their every move. The maze had just grown smaller. "How?" Elian asked, his voice barely a whisper. "There are technicians down here," Kale explained. "People who know how to break city tech. They work for a price." He looked at Elian, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "We don't have anything to trade." The reality of their situation settled heavily between them. They were fugitives with no resources, no allies, and a powerful, relentless enemy. The hope that had flickered to life in the aqueduct began to dim. Kale saw the despair on his face. He reached out, his thumb gently brushing Elian's cheek. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice imbued with a certainty that Elian couldn't fathom. "I didn't spend 10 years surviving the waste to fail now." He paused, his expression growing more serious. "Elian, do you remember? Anything from before?" Elian looked down at his hands. "Fragments," he admitted. "Feelings. The scent of a flower, falling from a tree. Your eyes." He looked up, meeting Kale's gaze. "I remember feeling safe with you. I don't remember why." Kale's expression softened. "We were from the same settlement, Ashwood. They called it a re-education camp after the assimilation. Our families were resistant. They tried to hold on to the old ways, to the bonds that weren't sanctioned by the city." He looked away, a shadow of old pain crossing his face. "The enforcers came. They broke it all apart. They took the children with valuable genetic markers. You for your unique scent, me for my alpha potency. They were going to send me to a breeding program in a labor colony. I ran. They told me my family died in a plague," Elian said, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. It had been a clean, sterile story, one that explained his solitude without any messy details. "They lied," Kyle said simply. "They erased our past to make us easier to control. A plant with no roots is easy to move." He reached into his shirt and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch that hung from a cord around his neck. He opened it and tipped the contents into his palm. It was a single, dried and pressed flower, a wild hyacinth. "I kept it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "To remember your scent, to find you." Elian stared at the delicate, faded petals. This was the flower from his dreams, the source of the scent he had been taught to hate. It wasn't a flaw. It was a memory. It was a promise. A profound seismic shift occurred within him. The conditioning that had been the bedrock of his identity crumbled, turning to dust. He was not a product of House Arden. He was not Lord Valerius's intended. He was Elian of Ashwood, and this man, Kale, was his past, and he prayed his future. "The technician," Elian said, his voice stronger now, clearer. "What is the price?" Kyle looked at him, surprised by the sudden resolve in his tone. "Information. Tech. Something valuable from up top." A slow, dangerous idea began to form in Elian's mind. He had been raised in the heart of the system. He had been educated, conditioned, and prepared to be the mate of one of its most powerful men. He knew things, not technical specifications, but something more valuable. Protocol. "Lord Valerius," Elian said, the name no longer holding the same terror. "He has a private research outpost near the city's edge, Sector Gamma 7. It's where he studies anomalies, things that don't fit the system. It's his one weakness." Kale's eyes narrowed, his full attention on Elian. A weakness? His obsession with control. Elian elaborated, the pieces falling into place in his mind. "The outpost is shielded from the main city network. He believes standard security is flawed, so he uses an independent system keyed only to his personal biometric signature. But to maintain it, he has to physically sync his datapad with the outpost's core terminal once every cycle. It's a security ritual." He looked at Kale, his heart beating faster. "If we could get our hands on the data from his personal pad, it would be more valuable than any piece of tech." Kale stared at him, a new respect dawning in his eyes. This was not the fragile, broken Omega from the sanctum. This was someone who had been forged in the enemy's fire and had emerged with their secrets. "How do we get close to him?" Kale asked. "We don't," Elian replied, a grim smile touching his lips. "We let him come to us." He touched the collar on his neck. "This is a tracker, but it's also a leash. What happens when the asset on the end of the leash stops moving?" Kyle understood immediately. His own smile mirrored Elian's. "He'll get impatient. He'll want to retrieve his experiment himself rather than risk his clumsy enforcers damaging the specimen." It was a terrible risk, a direct confrontation with the most dangerous man in the city. But it was their only chance. They were no longer running. They were setting a trap. They found the technician, a wiry woman with cybernetically enhanced eyes, who called herself Fuse. She worked out of a cramped, chaotic shop filled with scavenged electronics, the air thick with the smell of ozone and burnt solar. She listened to their proposal, her multi-lensed eyes clicking and whirring as she studied the collar on Elian's neck. "Valerius's personal tech," she breathed, a greedy light in her optics. "The encryption alone is legendary. The data on his pad, that's not just a trade, that's a retirement plan." She agreed. The price was the data pad, all of it. She would provide them with the tools to disable the collar's remote systems and a device to perform a data rip, but it would have to be done at close range. "You get one shot," she warned, handing them a small metallic disc. "You place this on the back of his datapad. It'll clone the core memory, but it's slow. You'll need at least 30 seconds of direct contact." 30 seconds. An eternity when facing a man like Valerius. They found their location, a derelict maglev station in the lower transit levels, a place of shadows and intersecting tunnels that offered multiple escape routes. It was time to stop running. Elian sat on a rusted bench in the center of the station's main platform. The jacket Kyle had given him pulled tight around his shoulders. He was the bait. Kyle was hidden in the girders above, a silent predator waiting for the moment to strike. Elian focused on his breathing, trying to calm the frantic beating of his heart. He reached inward, past the hum of the collar, searching for the faint trace of his own scent. He thought of the pressed flower, of Ashwood, of Kale's promise. He coaxed the scent of wild hyacinth and winter air to life, letting it bloom faintly in the stale air, a beacon for the man who was hunting them. He did not have to wait long. A single figure emerged from the tunnel, walking with a calm, unhurried gait. It was Lord Valerius. He was alone. He had come himself, just as Elian had predicted. His obsession had made him predictable. An interesting choice of location, Valerius said, his voice echoing in the cavernous station. He stopped a dozen paces from Elian, his silver eyes taking in the scene. Theatrically desolate. Have you decided to surrender? I've decided to stop being an object, Elian replied, his voice shaking only slightly. He stood up to face him. My name is Elian. Valerius smiled his cold, thin smile. A name is just a label, and you are a label I have chosen to acquire. He took a step closer. The feral is nearby. I can smell his pathetic, territorial scent all over you. Let him watch. It is important for a specimen to observe the consequences of defiance. He raised his datapad, his fingers poised to input a command. Elian knew this was the moment. The command would likely be a paralytic agent delivered through the collar. He had to act now. You're wrong, Elian said, his voice ringing with a newfound strength. His scent isn't a mark of territory. It's a promise, something you could never understand. He took a deliberate step toward Valerius, closing the distance between them. It was the last thing the Alpha expected. The Omega was approaching him. Willingly, Valerius paused, his curiosity piqued by this new, defiant behavior. It was this curiosity, this analytical coldness, that was his undoing. As Elian stepped into his personal space, Kale dropped from the ceiling behind Valerius, silent as a falling shadow. He didn't make a sound. He simply clamped a hand over Valerius's mouth and drove a knee into the back of his legs, forcing the powerful Alpha to the ground. In the same motion, Elian lunged forward, not attacking, but grabbing the wrist that held the datapad. He pressed the data rip disk Fuse had given him onto the back of the device. A tiny green light blinked on. The 30-second countdown had begun. The 30 seconds that followed were the longest of Elian's life. Valerius, for all his cold calculation, was still a premier Alpha. His strength was immense. He thrashed in Kale's grip, a silent, furious struggle for dominance. Kale held on with grim tenacity, his muscles straining, a low growl of exertion rumbling in his chest. His entire focus was on immobilizing Valerius, on giving Elian the time he needed. Elian's job was to hold the datapad steady. His hands, slick with nervous sweat, clamped onto Valerius's wrist. The Alpha's silver eyes, wide with shock and fury, locked onto his. There was no analysis in them now, only pure, murderous rage. Elian saw the promise of a cold, painful death in that gaze. But he held on. He met that rage with the quiet, unyielding defiance of a soul that had already been broken and had nothing left to lose. The green light on the disc blinked, a slow, agonizing pulse. 10 seconds. Valerius twisted, trying to throw Kale off his back. Kale's arm, wrapped around the Alpha's neck, tightened, cutting off his air. It was a desperate, dangerous gambit. Valerius was fighting not just with strength, but with his presence, projecting waves of pure alpha dominance that were meant to cripple an omega, to force submission through sheer biological imperative. Elian felt the force of it, a pressure in his mind, a voice that whispered of obedience and failure. You are nothing. You are weak. Submit. But another presence pushed back. Kyle's. It was not a commanding force, but a steady, protective shield. It wrapped around Elian's mind, a warmth of pine and snow that held the coldness of Valerius's command at bay. You are mine. You are safe. Hold on. Elian focused on Kale's scent, on the feel of his strength flowing into him, and he held on. 20 seconds. The light blinked faster. Valerius, realizing his dominant command was failing, changed tactics. His free hand shot out, grabbing Elian's arm. His grip was like iron, his fingers digging into Elian's flesh with bruising force. Pain, sharp and blinding, shot up Elian's arm. He cried out, his grip on the datapad faltering. Elian. Kyle's voice was a strained roar. He couldn't release Valerius to help. The moment he did, Valerius would be free. It was all going to fail. They were going to die here, in this derelict station. But then, something bloomed inside Elian. It was a fire, born of desperation and a lifetime of suppressed rage. It was the fury of the boy from Ashwood, of the asset in the sanctum, of the fugitive in the undercroft. He would not fail. He would not let Kale's sacrifice be for nothing. He looked Valerius straight in the eye, and with his free hand he reached up and clawed his nails across the alpha's perfect marble face. The attack was so unexpected, so utterly undignified, that Valerius's concentration broke. His grip on Elian's arm loosened for a fraction of a second. It was enough. The light on the disc turned solid green, then winked out. The data rip was complete. Now, Elian screamed. Kyle released Valerius and kicked him away. In the same motion, he grabbed Elian, pulling him back as he ripped the disc from the datapad. Valerius scrambled to his feet, a raw, furious sound tearing from his throat. 4 angry red lines marred the pale perfection of his cheek. For the first time, Elian saw him as something other than a god or a scientist. He saw a man, bleeding and enraged. The illusion of his untouchable control was shattered. You will not leave this station alive, Valerius snarled, his voice a low, guttural promise of violence. He lunged, but Kale was already moving, pulling Elian toward a dark, gaping tunnel that led deeper into the transit network. They plunged into the darkness just as Valerius reached the spot where they had been. They ran, their footsteps echoing in the long, dark passage. They could hear Valerius behind them, his calm stride replaced by the heavy, pounding footsteps of a hunter giving chase. This way, Kale gasped, pulling Elian down a side passage, a narrow maintenance corridor he must have scouted earlier. They scrambled through, emerging into another identical derelict station. Kale didn't slow. He ran to the far end of the platform where a single, rusted maintenance cart sat on the tracks. Get in, he commanded, his hands already working on a control panel, pulling at wires. He won't call for backup, Elian said, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he climbed into the cart. This is personal now. His ego won't allow him to admit he was overpowered by a feral and an Omega. I'm counting on it, Kyle grunted, twisting 2 wires together. A shower of sparks erupted, and with a lurch, the cart's ancient motor coughed to life. It began to move, slowly at first, then picking up speed, rattling down the dark tunnel, away from Valerius. They looked back. The Alpha stood at the mouth of the tunnel, a dark silhouette against the faint light of the station. He was not running now. He was watching them go, his hand raised to the eat scratches on his face. His expression was no longer one of simple rage. It was something colder, something far more terrifying. It was the look of a man whose scientific curiosity had curdled into a deep, personal obsession. He would not stop, not ever. The cart rattled on, carrying them deeper into the forgotten veins of the city. Kale took the data-ripped disc from Ilian, his fingers brushing against his. "You were brave," he said, his voice soft. "I was terrified," Ilian admitted, his body finally starting to shake now that the immediate danger had passed. "Bravery isn't the absence of fear," Kale said, his golden eyes meeting Elian's in the dim light of the tunnel. "It's acting in spite of it." He looked at the scratches on his own arm, a deep gouge from where Valerius had struggled. Then he looked at Elian's bruised wrist. Without a word, he reached out and gently took Elian's hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. The simple, comforting touch was more intimate than anything Elian had ever experienced. They returned to Fuse's workshop, the data disk clutched in Kale's hand like a holy relic. The technician's cybernetic eyes widened as she took it, her metal fingers handling it with reverence. She plugged it into her console, and strings of complex code filled her screens. "It's all here," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "His private research, his financial networks, the city's hidden security protocols. He's a ghost in his own system. This is the key to the entire kingdom." She turned to them, her professional greed replaced by a grudging respect. "You two are either the bravest or the stupidest people I've ever met." She began to work, her fingers flying across her console. "A deal's a deal. Let's get that collar off you." The procedure was quick but nerve-wracking. Fuse used a high-frequency sonic blade to sever the collar's locking mechanism without triggering its anti-tampering defenses. The moment the silver band was cut away, Elian felt a profound sense of release, as if a weight he had been carrying his entire life had suddenly been lifted. He touched his neck, the skin pale and indented where the metal had rested for years. He was free of it. But the true freedom came a moment later. A sensation, faint at first, then growing stronger, bloomed from within him. It was his own scent, unfiltered, unsuppressed. The pure, clean fragrance of wild hyacinth and winter air filled the small workshop. It was stronger than he had ever imagined, a vibrant, living part of him that had been silenced for too long. He looked at Kale and saw the Alpha's eyes widen, his pupils dilating. Kale closed his eyes, inhaling deeply, a look of sublime contentment on his face. "There you are," he breathed. The scent was not a flaw. It was not a genetic anomaly. It was beautiful. It was him. And for the first time, standing in a grimy workshop in the bowels of the city, Elian felt truly, completely whole. Fuse, ever practical, cleared her throat. "Right, that's lovely. Now, about getting you out of the city." She tapped her console. "With this data, I can create a window for you. I can loop the surveillance at the western water culvert for exactly 90 seconds. You can slip through the gate. After that, you're in the wastes. You're on your own." She handed Kale a small, rugged datapad. "This has a map of the wastes and a copy of Valerius's research on you two. Might be useful to know what he knows." Her multi-lensed eyes settled on Elian. "He classified your scent as a primal Omega marker. something thought to be extinct. A scent that doesn't compel submission, but invites partnership. He thinks you're the key to creating a more stable, willing Omega class. Elian felt a chill. He had never been a person to Valerius. He was, and always would be, a resource to be exploited. Go, Fuse said, her attention already back on her screens. Your window opens in 1 hour, and don't come back. The western water culvert was a massive, grated tunnel that expelled the city's treated water runoff into the chemical-scarred marshlands of the wastes. It was their final gateway, their one chance to escape the city's confines for good. The air here was thick with the smell of algae and industrial cleansing agents, a final, lingering scent of their prison. They crouched behind a rusted pumping station, watching the culvert gate. Automated sentry guns swiveled on their mounts, their optical sensors sweeping the area in predictable patterns. Beyond the gate, Elian could see a landscape utterly alien to him. Grey, twisted trees, misty flats, and a vast, open sky the colour of slate. It was desolate. It was dangerous. It was beautiful. Kale checked the chronometer on the datapad Fuse had given them. 5 minutes. He looked at Elian, his expression serious in the gloom. They were dressed in the simple, durable fabrics of the undercroft, their faces smudged with grime to obscure their features. They looked like they belonged to the shadows now. Once we're through that gate, there's no going back, Kale said, his voice low. The wastes aren't easy. It's a hard life. Is it a free one? Elian asked, his gaze fixed on the open sky beyond the bars. Yes, Kale said, without hesitation. Then it's worth it, Elian replied, his voice firm. He had spent his life in a beautiful cage, and he would rather face the dangers of a harsh freedom than the slow, soul-crushing safety of captivity. He was no longer the frightened, compliant Omega from the sanctum. The undercroft, the confrontation with Valerius, the reclamation of his own scent. It had all forged him into someone new, or perhaps had simply allowed the person he was always meant to be to finally emerge. He felt Kyle's hand find his, their fingers lacing together. The contact was solid, reassuring. They were a unit, a pack of two. Whatever the wastes held, they would face it together. 2 minutes, Kyle whispered, his eyes on the sentry guns. When the light on the datapad turns green, we run. We'll have 90 seconds. It's a long way to the gate. Don't stop for anything. Elian nodded, his heart beginning to pound a steady, determined rhythm. This was not the frantic, terrified beat of the sanctum. This was the pulse of a life about to begin. He looked at Kale, at the fierce, unwavering loyalty in his golden eyes, at the set of his jaw. He remembered the boy who had given him a pressed flower, the man who had torn down the walls of his prison. He was not just his rescuer. He was his partner. He was his home. The datapad in Kale's hand beeped softly, its screen flashing from red to green. Now, Kale said. They broke from cover, their feet pounding on the damp ferrocrete. The world seemed to slow down. The sentry guns froze in their sweep, their optical sensors showing a looped image of an empty culvert entrance. The 90-second window had begun. They ran side by side, their hands still clasped together. The gate seemed impossibly far. The air was cold, biting at Elian's exposed skin. He could feel his own scent streaming behind him, a flag of defiance in the sterile air. Wild hyacinth and winter air, no longer a secret, no longer a flaw. It mingled with Kale's scent of pine and snow, twisting together to form something new, something that belonged only to them. They were halfway to the gate, 30 seconds gone. A distant alarm began to wail from the city wall behind them. Fuse's hack had been detected, or perhaps Valerius, in his fury, had overridden the system manually. It didn't matter. The illusion of a clean escape was gone. Faster, Kyle urged, pulling him along. Elian's lungs burned. His legs ached, but he pushed himself harder, fueled by the image of that open sky. They reached the massive, barred gate. Kyle slammed his hand against a release panel. Fuse had given him the code, and with a hiss of pneumatics, a small section of the gate slid open, just wide enough for them to squeeze through. 60 seconds gone. They scrambled through the opening, their feet sinking into the soft, damp earth of the wastes for the first time. They were out. They were free. But they were not safe yet. The sentry guns, their loop broken by the alarm, swiveled toward them, their barrels glowing with crimson energy. Kale shoved Elian behind him, shielding him with his body. "Keep going," he yelled, turning to face the guns. But before the guns could fire, a series of small, concussive explosions erupted at their bases. Fuse. The technician had built in a final, violent farewell gift. The guns crumpled, their targeting systems fried. A voice, tinny and synthesized, crackled from Kyle's datapad. "Retirement plan secured. You're on your own, kids. Don't get eaten." The connection died. Kyle stared for a moment at the smoking remains of the guns, then a slow, incredulous laugh escaped him. He turned to Elian, his face split by a wide, relieved grin. Elian found himself laughing too, a breathless, giddy sound he hadn't made since he was a child. They had done it. They had actually done it. They stood there for a moment, just breathing the wild, untamed air of the wastes. It smelled of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the distant promise of rain. It was the most beautiful thing Elian had ever smelled. From the top of the city wall, in a darkened observation deck, Lord Valerius watched them on a high-resolution monitor. The scratches on his face were stark against his pale skin. He was not smiling. His expression was one of intense, focused concentration. He watched the two figures, a tall Alpha and a slender Omega, standing together at the edge of his controlled world. He watched as the Alpha reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from the Omega's face. He saw the look that passed between them, a look of profound, unshakable connection. He had lost the assets, but his experiment was not over. It had merely entered a new phase, a field study. The wastes were vast and dangerous, but they were not infinite, and his resources were. He would give them time. He would let them build a life. He would let them believe they were safe. He would study their bond from a distance, learn its rhythms, its strengths, its weaknesses. And when the time was right, when they were at their most vulnerable, he would come for them. He would reclaim his variables, and he would finally solve the puzzle of their defiance. He zoomed the monitor in, focusing on Elian's face. The Omega was looking back toward the city, his expression not of fear, but of pity. Then he turned away, taking the feral's hand, and they walked together into the mists of the wastes, not looking back again. In the wild, Elian felt his senses, so long suppressed, coming alive. The ground beneath his feet was uneven, soft with moss and sharp with stones. The wind carried 1,000 scents he couldn't name. He looked at Kale, his silhouette strong and certain against the twilight sky. Their journey was far from over. Valerius would hunt them. The wastes would test them. But as Kale's hand tightened around his, Elian knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that he was no longer running from anything. He was walking toward everything. The bond between them, once a child's desperate promise, now a defiant reality, was their map and their compass. They were not an anomaly. They were a beginning,